So in the very first section of notes here, what we're going to look at is some different things involving data analysis, and in particular, some different things that are going to come up in the first chapter here with a lot of different terminology types of things. So as far as terminology goes, one of the first things we want to look at when we're talking about data is individuals and variables. So individuals, when we're talking about a set of data, are the objects described by a set of data. Individuals may be people, animals, or things. And when I show you an example of what we're talking about when we're differentiating data sets and individuals, I think the definition there will become a little more clear. The other thing we look at with data sets are variables, and a variable is any characteristic of an individual. So a variable can take on different values for different individuals. For example, if we took the students in the school, the individuals would be the students that are in the school, and some of the different variables that we would have would be their grade point averages, what types of shoes they wear, what their hair color is. So it's basically characteristics about the students would be considered the variables. And just keep in mind, variable meaning things that could vary within any individual student. So some different things when we're talking about data sets. So when you first encounter a data set, some of the different questions that you want to ask yourself when you have a data set is, first, who are the individuals that are being described by the data? Very important that you understand what that is. The other thing is, how many individuals are there? Next would be, what are the variables? What is it that's varying about the individuals that are in the data set? In what unit is each of the variables recorded, if there is a unit? And then other questions to ponder, and we'll get to some different things with this down the road, but why, when, where, and how were the data produced? And those will be key elements to some things that we will look at in future lessons. So as far as types of data go, we're going to basically look at initially here two different types of data, one of which is what's called categorical data. And a categorical variable places an individual into one of several groups or categories. So if you take your individuals, so some of the different things that could vary about an individual that are categorical would be things like gender, race, occupation, hair color, types of shoes that somebody wears, things of that nature. The other type of data we're going to look at are what are called quantitative data. And a quantitative variable takes numerical values, and that's the key difference between categorical and quantitative. Quantitative variable takes numerical values for which it makes sense to find an average. So for instance, some of the different things that could vary about an individual that are quantitative are age or grade point average. So not every variable that takes number values is quantitative. For instance, zip code would be one example of a value that's numeric. However, that would be an example of a variable that is categorical. And the reason for that is because it doesn't really make much sense to find an average for a list of zip codes. So one of the things to sort of keep in mind is that, most variables that take on a numeric value are usually quantitative, and most variables that take on some type of word value, like for instance gender, male or female, those are typically categorical. But once again, don't just assume because a variable is numeric that means that it has to be quantitative. It has to, for it to be quantitative, it has to make sense to find an average for a group of numbers. So an example here, and this has to do with a census at a school. So it says data, individuals, and variables. Census at School is an international project that collects data about primary and secondary school students using surveys. Hundreds of thousands of students from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United Kingdom have taken part in the project since 2000. Data from the surveys are available at the project's website. We use the site's random data selector to choose 10 Canadian students who completed the survey in a recent year, and the table below displays the data. So what they have here is for the 10 Canadian students, they wanted to know what province they were from, what gender they were, how many languages they spoke, what hand they were, left or right-handed, what their height was in centimeters, what their wrist circumference was, that's the distance around their wrist, in millimeters, their preferred mode of communication, and the time that it takes them to travel to school. So the question here says, who are the individuals that are in this data set? So in this particular instance, just note that they chose 10 Canadian students to complete the survey. So in this particular data set, the individuals would be, in this case, are the 10 randomly selected Canadian students. So those are the individuals that we collected this data here about. So those are the individuals. So next, part B says, what variables were measured? Identify each as categorical or quantitative, and in what units were the quantitative variables measured. So as we go through each of the different variables here, so if we talk about province, so province would be an example of a categorical variable, because you can see here the answers here are more of a sort of word type fashion. Gender would also be an example of a categorical variable, because once again we have males and females as the responses to what gender they have. Now, however, languages spoken, that would be an example of a quantitative variable, because it would make sense to find what the average number of languages that were spoken were for those 10 students. As far as handed goes, those would be that would be an example of a categorical variable, since it's a left or right hand type of response. The height in this case, okay, would be a quantitative variable, and that quantitative variable would be measured in centimeters, which is what it says here. Wrist circumference, that would also be a quantitative variable, and once again that would be measured in millimeters. The preferred mode of communication, that would be an example of a categorical variable. And then the last variable here is travel time to school. That would be an example of a quantitative variable, and that is measured in minutes. So in terms of just listing the different variables and what type they are, this is what we got here. So we got the 8 variables. Our province, these are just the variables themselves. Province, we have gender, we have number of languages spoken, we got dominant hand, we have height, wrist circumference, preferred communication method, and travel time to school. Those are the 8 different variables that were measured amongst the 10 different individuals that the data were collected about. And then for part C, we have here describe the individual in the highlighted row. So the highlighted row is this row right here. So what we would say about that highlighted row, or the individual that's in that highlighted row, is we would say that this is a student who lives in Ontario, is male, speaks 3 languages, is left-handed, is approximately 150 centimeters, has a wrist circumference of 100 millimeters. Their preferred mode of communication is an internet chat, and it takes them approximately 10 minutes to get to school. So those are some different things that you should be able to identify in terms of individuals and variables, and then also being able to differentiate amongst the different variables what type they are, whether they're categorical or quantitative. So some other terminology that goes with some of the different aspects of variables here would be a distribution. So when we're talking about quantitative variables may take values that are close together or values that are spread far apart from each other. And we call the pattern of the variation of a variable its distribution. And the distribution of a variable often tells us what values the variable takes and how often it takes these values. And one of the things that we will get into looking at in future chapters is the different types of distributions that are out there when you're collecting data. So as far as exploration goes when it comes to data, one of the things that you want to begin by doing is examining each variable by itself And then what you're looking to do once you examine each variable is you want to move on to study the relationships among those variables within the individuals. So oftentimes what we will do when we're exploring data is we'll start with some type of graph, or even in some cases multiple graphs, and then we'll try to add some numeric summaries based on what some of those different graphs look like. And one of the things that we will look at in the next couple sections is some of the different types of graphs that go with categorical variables, some of the different types of graphs that also go with quantitative variables. So one of the things that you'll notice in the notes that we're going to do here is periodically I will give you these different checkpoint questions. And what the checkpoint questions are is a chance for you to try to sort of assess on your own where you're at and be able to try to answer the question that's given on your own. So the question here says, Jake is a car buff who wants to find out more about the vehicles that students at his school drive. He gets permission to go to the student parking lot and record some data. Later he does some research about each model of the car on the internet. Finally, Jake makes a spreadsheet that includes each car's model, year, color, number of cylinders, gas mileage, weight, and whether it has a navigation system. So question number 1 says, who are the individuals in Jake's study? So take a few minutes and see what you can do with these checkpoint questions on your own. So as far as the answer to question 1, who are the individuals in Jake's study? Well, the individuals in this case would be the students that are in the cars that are in the student parking lot, because that's where Jake is going to get his data from. Question number 2 says, what variables did Jake measure? Identify each as categorical or quantitative. So as far as the variables that he measured, the variables here would be the car's model, which is categorical. There's the year of the car, which is quantitative. There's the color of the car, which is categorical. There were the number of cylinders, which is quantitative. There's gas mileage, which is also quantitative. Whether it has a navigation system, which would be yes or no, that's categorical. And then finally, the weight of the vehicle would be considered a quantitative variable. So one of the last sort of terms that we're going to look at here in the introduction is what's called inference. And one of the big things that we do in statistics is we try to gather data in order to take that data and make a conclusion about the population at large. So when we're talking about what's known as inferential statistics, what you're trying to do is you're trying to reach conclusions that extend beyond the immediate data alone. So for instance here, we use inferential statistics to try to infer, try to predict from the sample data what the population might think. And the ability to do inference is determined by how the data are produced. So the process of inference, and a lot of what we're going to look at, is you gather some data, which in this case we're going to call sample data, and you try to use the results of your sample data to make predictions about the population at large. And that process that we're going to go through, and there's a lot of different ways to collect sample data, that process that you go through to do that is what is referred to as inference. So just some different things here summarizing what we just discussed, some different things with individuals and variables, some different things with categorical and quantitative variables, also some different things involving distributions. And one of the things that we will look at in the next section is a more closer look at some of the different things that are involved with categorical variables, and in particular some of the different graphing methods that are associated with categorical variables.